If a man offers you everything but asks for nothing in return, what is he really taking? The lights were too bright, too white, reflecting off polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers that shimmered like they were watching her every breath as Amara Collins stood at the end of the aisle. Her fingers curled tightly around a bouquet she barely felt, the soft hum of whispers weaving through the room like a living thing. Every eye fixed on her, not with warmth but curiosity, judgment, speculation. Because everyone in that room knew what this was, a deal dressed up as a wedding, a contract wrapped in silk and vows. And at the altar stood Ethan Caldwell, tall, composed, untouchable, a man whose name carried weight across boardrooms and headlines. His expression carved from restraint, as if even this moment belonged to a schedule he had already outgrown. And when her father gently placed her hand into Ethan's, the contrast was immediate, her warmth against his stillness, her quiet breath against his measured calm. The officiant spoke, but the words blurred into something distant, something secondary, because the truth sat heavier beneath her ribs than anything spoken aloud. She wasn't here for love. She was here because a signature could save her family from losing everything, because desperation had a way of rewriting dignity into silence. And when the question came, when the room seemed to hold its breath, she said yes, not because she wanted to, but because she had to, and Ethan, without hesitation, said yes in return, his voice steady, low, controlled, like a man agreeing to terms already negotiated. And just like that, the cameras flashed, capturing a moment that looked like unity but felt like distance. And as applause filled the air, it sounded hollow to her, like something echoing off walls that didn't belong to her life. Later, when the doors closed behind them and the crowd became nothing more than a fading noise, the silence between them grew louder, thicker, until Ethan finally spoke. Not unkind, not cold, just clear. "There are boundaries," he said, his eyes meeting hers not with ownership, but with something firmer, something deliberate. "This arrangement stays exactly that. I won't take anything you don't choose to give." And for a second, Amara didn't respond, because that wasn't what she expected, not from a man who could buy anything he wanted, not from someone who had every reason to treat this like possession. But he stepped back instead, giving her space, real space, as if her presence required permission, and it unsettled her more than control ever could, because control was predictable. But this restraint, this quiet refusal, it felt like something she didn't know how to name. And as she stood there in a room that was now hers but didn't feel like home, Amara realized the most dangerous part of this marriage wasn't the contract. It was the man who refused to act like one. The house was quiet in a way that did not feel peaceful, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls and settled into the corners like it was waiting for something to break. And Amara stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, still in the dress she had not chosen, watching the city stretch beneath her in endless lights that did not belong to her world, her reflection faint in the glass. A woman placed into a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt carefully measured on the inside. She heard his footsteps before she turned, steady, unhurried. And when Ethan stepped into the room, he did not come close. He did not reach for her. He simply stopped at a distance that felt intentional, as if even proximity required consent. His jacket already gone, sleeves rolled just enough to show he had stepped out of the public version of himself, but not fully into anything personal. "Your family's situation has been handled," he said, his voice calm, not expecting gratitude, not waiting for it either. And for a moment she just stared at him, because those words should have felt like relief. They should have lifted something off her chest. But instead they left behind a question she could not ignore. What did he actually want in return? "You did not have to move that fast," she said quietly, her voice steady but careful, and he gave a small shake of his head. Not dismissive, just certain. "I did," he replied. "That was the agreement." And again, there it was, the word that kept everything in place. Agreement, something clean, something controlled, something that kept emotion out of reach. Amara exhaled slowly, setting the bouquet down on a nearby table like it no longer had a role to play. "Most men would expect something more after signing a contract like this," she said, not accusing, just stating what the world had taught her to expect. And Ethan's gaze held hers, steady, unreadable but not cold. Most men would. He agreed, and then after a brief pause that felt heavier than his words, he added, I am not interested in taking something that was never offered. And the room shifted, not physically, but in the way her understanding tilted slightly off balance, because there was no performance in his tone, no hidden edge, just a boundary that sounded more like protection than distance. And that made it harder to stand where she was, harder to hold on to the version of him she had prepared herself to face. Days passed in a rhythm that felt almost unreal. The staff moved around her with quiet efficiency, addressing her with respect that felt practiced but not fake. The house adjusted to her presence without asking anything from her in return, and Ethan remained consistent, present, but never intrusive. Their conversations brief, purposeful, always leaving space where something more could have been but never crossed into it. And outside those walls, the world had already decided who she was. Headlines painted her as opportunistic. Whispers reduced her story to something shallow. A woman who married into wealth for survival. And she saw it all. Every comment, every assumption. Each one landing with a weight she refused to show, because reacting would only confirm what they already believed. And one evening, as she sat alone in a quiet dining room that could seat 20 but held only her, her phone lit up again with another article dissecting her life like it was public property. She set it down slowly, her appetite gone, her composure intact but thinner than before. And that was when Ethan entered, not announced, not abrupt, just there. His presence steady as he took in the untouched plate, the tension she thought she had hidden, and he did not ask what was wrong. He did not demand an explanation. He simply reached for the phone, glanced at the screen for a brief second, and then set it face down on the table, his expression unchanged but his decision clear. You do not have to read what they think they understand, he said, his voice low, controlled, and something in the way he said it made it feel less like advice and more like permission. And for the first time since she had stepped into his world, Amara felt something shift inside her. Not trust, not yet, but the quiet beginning of it, because this man, with every reason to control her story, was choosing instead to give it back to her. The next morning came with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, like the house itself had learned her rhythm and adjusted to it. And Amara stood in the kitchen earlier than anyone else, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug she had not asked for, but somehow felt chosen for her. The soft hum of the coffee machine fading into the background as sunlight stretched slowly across the marble counters, warm but distant. And for the first time since the wedding, she allowed herself to breathe without the weight of an audience, without cameras, without whispers, just the quiet reality of where she now stood. But peace never lasted long in a world that watched everything. Because by the time she picked up her phone, the noise had already found her again. Headlines sharper than before, narratives more confident, strangers deciding her story with certainty they had not earned. And she read just enough to feel the edge of it before setting the phone down. Not out of denial but out of control, because she refused to let their version define her. And yet the silence that followed felt heavier than before, like something was building beneath it, something she could not quite name. Footsteps approached again, steady, familiar now. And when Ethan entered, he paused just slightly when he saw her already awake, as if recalibrating a routine that had not included her before. You should not have to adjust to this house, he said, his voice even, almost thoughtful. The house adjusts to you. And it was such a simple statement, but it landed differently, not as control, not as command, but as acknowledgement. And Amara met his gaze, studying him more closely. This time, not as the man she had been told he was, but as the one standing in front of her. You make everything sound easy, she replied, her tone calm but layered. And he gave the smallest shake of his head, almost unnoticeable. It is not easy, he said. It is just handled. And there it was again, the way he separated emotion from action, not to avoid it, but to keep it from overwhelming what needed to be done. And later that afternoon, the world outside demanded her presence again, a charity event tied to his company, one she had no choice but to attend. And as she stood in front of the mirror, dressed in something chosen by stylists who understood appearances better than people, she saw the version of herself the world would accept, polished, composed, distant. But inside, she was still measuring every step, every glance, every word. because this was not her world. Not yet. The event was exactly what she expected. Bright lights, controlled smiles, conversations that carried more meaning beneath their surface than in their words. And as she walked beside Ethan, she felt the shift in attention. The way eyes followed her not with admiration but with analysis, as if they were waiting for her to confirm what they already believed. And the questions came, subtle but sharp, about timing, about intentions, about how quickly everything had happened. And she answered with grace, with restraint, never giving them more than they deserved. But the weight of it built, moment by moment, until someone finally said it, not loudly, not cruelly, but clearly enough to land. "You must feel very lucky." And for a second, the room seemed to narrow, not because of the words, but because of what they implied, that she had gained something without earning it, that she had stepped into a life she did not belong to. And Amara held her posture, her expression unchanged, her silence intentional. But before she could respond, Ethan did, not by correcting the person, not by creating a scene, but by stepping slightly closer, just enough to shift the dynamic, just enough to make it clear without saying a word that she was not standing there alone. And his voice, when it came, was calm, steady, impossible to misread. "Luck has nothing to do with it," he said, and there was no anger in it, no need to prove anything, just a quiet certainty that ended the conversation before it could continue. And the moment passed, the room adjusted, people moved on, but something stayed with her, something deeper than the words themselves, because he had not defended her for the sake of image. He had not turned it into a statement. He had simply stood where he needed to stand. And for the first time, Amara felt the shift more clearly, not in the world around her, but within herself, because the man she had married for survival was slowly becoming the one thing she had not prepared for, someone she could no longer see as just part of a contract. The drive back was quieter than the event itself, the city lights streaking past the tinted windows in long blurred lines as Amara sat beside Ethan, her hands folded loosely in her lap, the silence between them no longer sharp, but not entirely comfortable either. It had changed, softened at the edges, like something unspoken was beginning to take shape. And when the car came to a stop in front of the house, neither of them moved immediately, the engine idling for a brief moment before the driver stepped out, leaving them in a stillness that felt intentional, as if time itself had slowed just enough to notice the shift. Amara turned slightly, her voice quieter than before but steadier. "You did not have to say anything back there," she said, not as a question but as a recognition, and Ethan's gaze met hers, direct, unguarded in a way she had not seen before. "Yes, I did," he replied simply, and again, no performance, no attempt to frame it as something more than it was, just a decision made in the moment. And she studied him for a second longer, searching for something she could define, something that would make sense of the way he moved through situations without hesitation but also without force. And she realized the difference was not in what he did, but in what he refused to do. He never took control away from her, even when it would have been easier. And that thought followed her as she stepped out of the car, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she walked inside. The house quiet again, but this time it did not feel as distant. It felt like a space waiting to be understood. Hours passed, the night stretching into something slower, more reflective, and Amara found herself unable to sleep, her mind replaying moments she had not expected to matter. The way he stood beside her without drawing attention to it, the way his voice carried certainty without pressure, the way he never once made her feel like she owed him anything. And that was the part she could not reconcile, because everything about their situation suggested obligation, yet he treated it like a choice. And sometime past midnight, she left her room, drawn by the faint light at the end of the hallway, the study door slightly open, and inside, Ethan sat at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled again. A quiet focus in the way he moved through documents, the glow of a single lamp casting soft shadows across the room. He did not look up right away, but when he did, there was no surprise in his expression, as if he had expected her to be there. "You should be resting," he said, his tone even, not reprimanding, just observant. And Amara stepped inside slowly, her footsteps soft against the floor. "I could say the same thing to you," she replied, and a faint shift touched his expression. Not quite a smile, but something close. This is easier, he said, gesturing lightly to the work in front of him, and she leaned slightly against the edge of the desk, not too close, not too far, maintaining the space they had both learned to respect. You always make things easier by turning them into tasks, she said, and he considered that for a moment before answering. Tasks can be completed, he said. People are more complicated. And there it was again, that careful separation, not avoidance, but awareness, and Amara's gaze softened just slightly. Because for the first time, she saw the effort behind his control, not coldness, but discipline, not distance, but restraint, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they were not saying, until she finally asked the question that had been sitting quietly beneath everything else. Why did you really agree to this? She said, her voice calm but steady, not accusing, just seeking something real. And Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes holding hers in a way that felt heavier than before, as if the truth required more than words. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. Because it gave you a way out, he said, and the simplicity of it landed deeper than any explanation could have, because it was not about what he gained, it was about what she needed. And for a moment, Amara forgot every assumption she had made about him, every expectation she had carried into this, because standing there in the quiet of that room, she realized something that unsettled her more than anything else. She was no longer trying to survive this marriage. She was starting to understand it. And that was the moment everything began to change. Morning arrived with a softer light than before, the kind that did not demand attention, but settled gently across the room. And Amara stood by the window again, though this time her posture was different, less guarded, less prepared for something to go wrong. The city below still moved at its usual pace, cars threading through streets, people chasing schedules that did not include her. But for once, she did not feel like she was standing outside of everything. She felt like she was beginning to understand where she stood, and that shift, quiet as it was, made everything else feel more real. Footsteps approached again, familiar now in rhythm and presence. And when Ethan entered, there was no hesitation in the way he acknowledged her, no pause as if recalculating how to exist in the same space. You are up early again, he said, his voice steady, and she turned slightly, meeting his gaze without the distance she once held. I could not sleep, she replied, but there was no tension in it, no weight of discomfort, just honesty. And he nodded once, not pressing further, not asking questions that were not his to ask. And for a moment, they stood there in a silence that no longer felt empty. It felt shared, and that difference, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed. The day unfolded with a quiet routine that still felt new but no longer foreign. Conversations remained brief but carried more meaning beneath them, small acknowledgments that built something neither of them named, until the outside world found its way back in, not through headlines this time, but through something closer, something harder to ignore, a call from her mother, the first since the wedding. And when Amara stepped into a private corner to answer, her voice softened in a way it had not in days. Mom, she said, and the relief on the other end was immediate, layered with gratitude, with emotion, with the kind of understanding that did not need explanation. Her family was safe now. Their situation stabilized in ways that had once felt impossible, and her mother's voice carried both thanks and something else, something quieter, something more cautious. Are you okay? She asked, and the question lingered longer than expected, because it was not about the house, not about the money. It was about her, about the choice she had made, about the life she had stepped into. And Amara paused, just long enough to realize that the answer was not as simple as it should have been. I am learning, she said finally, her voice steady but thoughtful. And when the call ended, she remained there for a moment, the weight of that answer settling in, because it was the truth. She was learning him, learning this life, learning what it meant to exist in something that was supposed to be temporary, but was starting to feel more permanent than she had planned for. And when she turned back, Ethan was there, not intruding, not waiting, just present, as if he had been there long enough to understand when to speak and when to remain silent. Your family is doing well, he said, not as a question, but as a quiet confirmation, and she nodded, a small breath leaving her as something inside her eased. They are, she replied, and then, after a brief pause, she added, Because of you. And the words were simple, but they carried more than gratitude. They carried acknowledgement, and Ethan met her gaze without shifting, without deflecting, but also without accepting it in a way that created imbalance. Because of the agreement, he said, correcting the weight of the moment back into something controlled, something defined. And that was when she realized the difference between them had not changed. He still saw this as something structured, something contained, while she was beginning to feel the edges of it blur, and that realization stayed with her throughout the day, quiet but persistent, until evening settled in. Again, and the house returned to its familiar stillness. And as she stood once more in a space that had once felt too large, too distant, Amara understood something that unsettled her in a way she could not ignore. The contract had been meant to save her family, to give her a way out, but somewhere along the way, it had become something else entirely, something she was no longer sure she wanted to walk away from. The days no longer felt like something she had to endure. They unfolded with a quiet rhythm that Amara had begun to understand, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because she had, and that shift made even the smallest moments feel different. The way the house no longer echoed with unfamiliar silence, the way the staff spoke to her with ease instead of caution, the way Ethan's presence had become something steady rather than distant. And yet beneath all of it, there was something building, something she could feel but had not yet faced, because understanding him had made it harder to hold on to the idea that this was temporary. And that thought lingered with her as she stepped into his office later that afternoon, not invited, but not unwelcome either. The door opened just enough to suggest she could enter if she chose to. And she did, her footsteps soft against the floor as Ethan looked up from his desk, his expression shifting just slightly, not surprised, just attentive. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice calm. And she shook her head, stepping further inside, her posture steady but her thoughts more deliberate than before. "No," she said, and then after a brief pause, "I just wanted to ask you something." And that alone was different, because until now, she had not needed anything from him beyond what had already been agreed upon, and he noticed that too. The way his focus sharpened just slightly, not tense, but aware. "Go ahead," he said, setting his pen down, giving her his full attention in a way that made it clear she was not interrupting anything important. And for a moment, Amara hesitated, not because she did not know what to say, but because she understood what the question meant. "How long?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but certain. How long was this supposed to last? And the room shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, the air tightening just slightly as Ethan held her gaze, his answer not immediate, not because he did not know it, but because he understood what answering it would change. "Until your family was secure," he said, his tone even, controlled, but not distant, and she nodded once, absorbing it, because that had always been the plan, the boundary, the end point she had built everything around. And yet hearing it now felt different, heavier, like something she was no longer sure she agreed with. "And now they are," she said, not as a question, but as a fact, and again, he nodded. "Yes," he replied, and the simplicity of it left no room for interpretation. The contract had been fulfilled, the purpose had been served, and for a second, neither of them spoke, because the next part did not belong to the agreement. It belonged to them. And that was something neither of them had prepared for. Amara exhaled slowly, her hands resting lightly against the back of a chair as she steadied herself, not physically, but emotionally, because for the first time, she was standing in a moment where she had a choice, a real one, not driven by necessity, not shaped by pressure, just a decision that belonged entirely to her. "So I can leave," she said, and the words hung in the air longer than expected, not dramatic, not heavy with emotion, just clear, and Ethan's expression did not change, not outwardly, but something in his stillness deepened, something in the way he held that moment without interrupting it, without redirecting it. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady, and there it was, no hesitation, no attempt to convince her otherwise, no shift in tone to make her reconsider, just the truth, because that was what he had promised from the beginning, that nothing would be taken from her, not even her choice to walk away. And for a second, Amara felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not regret, but something harder to define, because she had expected resistance, expected some form of negotiation, but instead, he gave her exactly what he said he would, freedom, and that made it harder than anything else, because now, whatever she chose next would not be because she had to stay, it would be because she wanted to, and that realization settled between them, quiet but undeniable, as she stood there looking at a man who had given her everything she needed to leave, and yet was the only reason she was no longer sure she could. The word lingered long after it was spoken, not because of how it sounded, but because of what it allowed, and Amara did not move. Right away, her fingers still resting against the chair as if letting go of it would mean stepping into something she had not yet decided. The room remained quiet, steady, unchanged, but inside her, everything had shifted, because for the first time since this began, there was no pressure guiding her next step, no urgency forcing her forward, only choice. And that kind of freedom felt heavier than any obligation she had carried before. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window. Behind Ethan, the city stretched out in front of her again, the same view she had stood in front of days ago, but it did not look the same now. It felt different, as if the distance between her and everything she once knew had grown clearer, more defined, and she realized something then. Leaving would not take her back to who she was before, it would only move her into another version of herself, one shaped by everything that had happened here, and that truth made the decision less about escape and more about direction. "You would not stop me," she said quietly, not because she doubted it, but because she needed to hear it again, needed to understand the full weight of what he was offering. And Ethan's answer did not change, his voice just as steady, just as certain. "No," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no hidden condition, no attempt to soften the impact, just the same unwavering respect he had shown from the beginning. And that was what made it harder, because he was not holding her here, he was not binding her to anything beyond what she chose, and that kind of restraint was not something she had been prepared for. She stepped away from the chair then, slowly, deliberately, her posture straight, but her thoughts moving faster than she let them show. Every moment she had spent in this house, every word he had spoken, every action he had taken without expectation, they all surfaced now, not as isolated memories, but as something connected, something that built into a truth she could no longer ignore. He had never treated her like part of a transaction, even when that was exactly what this was supposed to be. He had never crossed a line, never taken advantage of the space between them, never asked for anything she had not freely given. And standing there, she realized that what he had offered her was not just a way out for her family. It was something far more rare, something she had not known she needed until now. The chance to exist in a space where her choices were entirely her own, and that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it forced her to face a question she had not been ready to ask, not about him, but about herself. What did she actually want? The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It was not filled with uncertainty. It was filled with clarity forming in real time. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, but stronger, more certain than before. "I thought leaving would feel like relief," she said, her gaze steady now, not avoiding his. "But it does not." And Ethan did not interrupt, did not try to interpret her words. He simply listened, giving her the space to finish what she needed to say. And that alone told her everything she needed to know, because even now, even in this moment where everything could change, he was still choosing not to take control. And that was the final shift, the moment where understanding turned into something deeper, something she could no longer pretend was temporary. "It feels like I would be walking away from something I have not fully understood yet," she continued, her breath steady, her posture unwavering, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty in her words, just truth, and the room seemed to settle around that, the tension easing not because the answer was simple, but because it was honest. And Ethan's gaze remained on her, not searching for more, not pushing for clarity, just present, just steady, as if whatever she chose next, he would accept it without question. And that was when Amara realized the final piece of it. She had come into this marriage with no choice at all, but now, standing here with every option open in front of her, she was no longer choosing out of necessity. She was choosing because something inside her had changed, something she could not undo. And for the first time since she had said yes at the altar, that choice belonged entirely to her. The silence that followed her words did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt complete, like something had finally settled into place after being held too tightly for too long. And Amara did not look away this time. Her gaze steady on Ethan as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time, without the weight of assumptions, without the boundaries she had built to protect herself. And he stood exactly as he always had, composed, controlled, giving her the space to decide without stepping into it, without shaping it. And that was the moment she understood the difference between power and restraint, because he had always had the power to influence her choice, but he never used it, not once. And that realization shifted something deeper than emotion. It shifted the way she saw him entirely. She took a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as the tension she had carried began to fade, not because the situation was easier, but because she had finally stopped resisting it. "You knew this would happen," she said, quietly, not accusing, not even questioning, just recognizing something that had been there all along. And Ethan's expression remained unchanged, but there was a subtle pause before he answered, as if he understood the weight behind her words. "No," he said, his voice calm. "I knew you would have a choice." And that answer, simple as it was, held more meaning than anything else he could have said, because it was never about predicting her feelings. It was about protecting her ability to decide them for herself. And Amara let that settle. Let it move through her without interruption, because for the first time, she was not trying to analyze him. She was accepting what he had shown her through every action, every silence, every moment where he stepped back instead of forward. She moved then, not away from him, but closer, not crossing a boundary, but acknowledging the space between them in a way that felt intentional. And her voice, when she spoke again, carried a quiet certainty that had not been there before. "I can leave," she said, repeating the truth, but this time it sounded different, less like an option, more like a realization. And Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady, not searching for anything more, not expecting anything less. "Yes," he said again, and the repetition did not weaken the moment, it strengthened it, because it proved that nothing about his stance had changed, not even now, not even when the outcome mattered. And Amara felt something shift fully into place, something that had been building since the day she walked down that aisle, something she could no longer ignore or dismiss as temporary, because it was not, it had never been, it had just taken her time to see it. "But I am not leaving," she said finally, her voice calm, not rushed, not emotional, just clear, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just true. And for the first time, Ethan's stillness changed, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but she saw it, the smallest shift in the way he held himself, the way his breath slowed just slightly, as if something he had kept contained had finally been acknowledged. And yet he did not step forward, did not close the distance, did not reach for her, because even now, even in this moment, he was waiting, not for permission, but for her to define what came next. And Amara understood that too. She understood that staying was only the beginning, that what mattered now was why she stayed, and she met his gaze with that same quiet certainty. "Not because I have to," she continued, her voice steady, "but because I want to understand what this is, what it could be." And the honesty in her words carried more weight than any declaration, because it was not built on obligation or expectation, it was built on choice, and the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like something waiting to be crossed, not rushed, not forced, just acknowledged. And in that moment, the contract that had once defined everything between them faded into the background, replaced by something neither of them had planned for, something that could not be written or negotiated, something that only existed because they had both allowed it to. And as the quiet of the room settled around them once more, Amara realized that for the first time since this began, she was not standing in a life she had been given. She was standing in one she had chosen. The words did not echo. They settled, quiet and certain, like something that had finally found where it belonged. And for a moment neither of them moved, not because they did not know what came next, but because what came next no longer needed to be rushed. Amara stood where she was, steady in a way she had never been at the beginning of this, no longer bracing herself for what might be taken, no longer measuring every step against what she might lose, because there was nothing left being held over her, only what she chose to keep, and Ethan remained across from her. The same distance, the same restraint, but something had shifted. Beneath it, something quieter, deeper, not visible in his posture, but present in the stillness between them, as if the space that once separated them had changed into something that connected them instead. "Then we start again," he said finally, his voice calm, not as a declaration, not as a demand, but as an offering, and the simplicity of it carried more meaning than anything elaborate ever could, because starting again meant leaving behind everything that had defined them until now. The contract, the obligation, the careful boundaries that had kept them safe but also kept them apart. And Amara felt that weight, not as pressure, but as possibility. She nodded once, a small movement but intentional. "Not as strangers," she replied, her voice steady, and for the first time, there was no distance in it, no hesitation, just clarity, and something in Ethan's expression softened, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to see it, enough to know that. He had heard what she meant beneath the words. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, and Amara took a step forward, not because she had to, not because anything required it, but because she wanted to close the distance that no longer served a purpose. And when she stopped, it was not far from where he stood, close enough to feel the shift, close enough to make the space between them intentional rather than necessary. She looked at him then, not as the man she had married out of desperation, not as the man the world thought they understood, but as the one who had stood beside her without ever taking more than she gave, the one who had made room for her to choose, even when that choice could have taken her away from him entirely. "You could have made this easier for yourself," she said quietly, her gaze steady. "You could have asked for more, expected more," and Ethan held her gaze, his answer just as steady, just as certain as it had always been. "That would not have been yours to give," he said, and there it was. The same truth that had defined everything from the beginning, unchanged, unwavering, and that consistency, that refusal to take what was not freely offered, was the very thing that had changed everything. Amara felt a quiet breath leave her, not tension, not uncertainty, just something releasing, something settling, because she understood now, not just what he had done, but why it mattered, why it had made her stay, why it had turned something temporary into something real. "Then this is mine to give," she said softly, not as a promise, not as something forced, but as a recognition of her own choice. And the words did not need to be explained further. They carried everything they needed to. And for the first time, Ethan moved without hesitation, not stepping into her space, but meeting her where she had chosen to stand, his presence no longer defined by distance, but by alignment. And the quiet between them shifted again, no longer a boundary, no longer a question, but something shared, something understood, and outside. The city continued as it always had, lights stretching into the distance. People moving through lives that would never intersect with this moment. But inside that room, something had been rewritten, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the only way that mattered, through choice, through respect, through a decision made without pressure or expectation. And as Amara stood there, no longer held by what had brought her here, but grounded in what she had chosen, she realized that this was never about falling into something unexpected. It was about recognizing something that had been built carefully, quietly, from the very beginning, and choosing it anyway.